It all began quietly, almost too quietly, on the far edge of my ranch. My land stretched across rolling acres of grass and hardwood trees, bordered on one side by a creek and on the other by a paved suburban development that had sprouted up. Like a weed in the last 20 years, my family's ranch had stood for over a century and a half, a stubborn survivor of time, heritage, and battles both natural and legal. For generations, we had kept to ourselves, letting the land speak for us. But while we had history, the new development had ambition. Shiny houses lined the once empty field. Neatly trimmed lawns formed an artificial quilt of conformity, and of course, a homeowners association had been created to rule over every blade of grass in that neighborhood. To them, my land was nothing but an unused resource, an eyesore in their perfect suburban picture. At first, I didn't notice their plans. I rarely wandered near the property line that bordered their community, and my cattle preferred the open fields closer to the barn. It wasn't until I drove my truck out to mend a fence one summer morning that I noticed something peculiar, bright, multicolored equipment sticking up beyond the hedge line. At first glance, it looked like a construction site. But when I parked, climbed the small hill, and looked down, I realized the truth. On my land, and on my side of the deeded boundary, and a playground was being built. Slides, swings, even a set of monkey bars stood half-assembled. The ground beneath was freshly leveled, gravel scattered, and workers were hauling in lumber to build benches. To the untrained eye, it looked like a harmless little community project. To me, it was the clearest form of trespass I had ever seen. The HOA had decided my property was theirs. I didn't need to check my survey lines. I knew them by heart. The markers were clear, the fences had stood in place for decades, and even the creek running along the side served as a natural divider. This playground wasn't just an accident. It was intentional. Over the following days, I watched the work continue. Trucks came in, offloading supplies. Parents from the nearby homes stood around clapping, talking about how wonderful it would be to have a safe spot for their children to play. They acted as though the land had always been theirs, as though my family's claim on it was invisible. To them, my silence was permission. I stayed quiet at first, keeping records, snapping photos, and digging up the old property deeds. The ranch had been surveyed multiple times over the last century, and every document told the same story. The line ran exactly where I knew it did. That playground, every swing and slide sat squarely on my soil. By the time the construction was complete, I had amassed a mountain of evidence. And when the HOA held their grand opening day celebration, with balloons and banners, I stood on the edge of my own land and watched. Children laughed and ran across ground that belonged to me. Parents gossiped on benches built without my permission, and the HOA board cut a ribbon like conquering kings. That was when my plan began to form. The obvious reaction would have been to storm in, demand they dismantle the playground, and threaten them with legal action. But I had lived long enough to know that rash reactions rarely win wars. And this was no small skirmish. This was a war for control. Instead, I decided to bide my time. I let them enjoy the playground. I let the HOA invest more into landscaping around it. Let them install their little community sign. Let them hold more gatherings. The deeper they dug themselves into the illusion that the playground was theirs, the sweeter my strike would be. For months, I played the patient observer. I mended fences, tended to my cattle, and watched the HOA's smug entitlement grow. They used my land for their neighborhood newsletter photos. They bragged about having the nicest community in the county. And through it all, they remained blissfully ignorant of the storm that was quietly building over their heads. When the moment finally came, it was almost too easy. I had my lawyer draft a formal letter addressed to the HOA board. It was calm, professional, and devastating. In it, I laid out the facts. The playground sat squarely on my land, every piece of equipment a trespass, every gathering an unlawful use of my property. I attached the deeds, the surveys, and the photographs. Then I delivered the blow. They owed me rent. Not just a little rent, back rent, calculated at a commercial land use rate for the duration of their illegal occupation, thousands upon thousands of dollars. And if they didn't pay up, the letter promised, I would see them in court for damages, legal fees, and immediate removal of the playground. The shockwave was immediate. The next week, the playground stood eerily empty. The once lively site of weekend barbecues and noisy laughter now looked abandoned, almost haunted. Parents whispered nervously. The board members held emergency meetings, and the air around the neighborhood shifted from smug confidence to silent dread. The HOA had built their pride and joy on a foundation of arrogance, and I had pulled the ground right out from beneath them. And yet I knew this was just the beginning. They wouldn't surrender so easily. No HOA, no entitled Karen, no smug suburban board ever did. They would resist, deny, and fight back in every underhanded way they could. But that was fine. I had been through worse. This was my land, my heritage, and my fight. And I wasn't about to lose. The rent bill was only the first shot. The HOA strikes back. The silence around the playground didn't last long. The HOA board wasn't the kind to tuck their tails between their legs and admit defeat. They had spent months pouring money, sweat, and smug pride into that playground, and they weren't about to let me, the stubborn rancher on the edge of their development, ruin their little suburban empire. At first, their resistance came in the form of denial. They posted an announcement in their community newsletter claiming the playground was well within HOA jurisdiction. They called my letter a misunderstanding and told residents not to worry. To the casual reader, it sounded like nothing more than a boundary dispute, a technical hiccup that would be sorted out soon. But I knew better. The HOA's tactic was simple: stall, downplay, and hope I would give up. They didn't realize who they were dealing with. Every day I drove past that playground, I noticed subtle changes. The benches were still there. The swings still swayed in the wind, but fewer and fewer families dared to use it. Parents whispered among themselves, uncertain whether they were letting their kids trespass every time they played. The HOA's confidence was cracking, but the board wasn't done yet. Within a week, I received their counter letter. It was stiff, dripping with self-importance, and signed by their legal counsel. In it, they claimed the playground was part of a community easement, some vague right-of-use clause they insisted gave them control over my property. They demanded I withdraw my rent demand and cease harassment. I read the letter twice, then laughed out loud. It was exactly the sort of bluff I expected from them. Their so-called easement was a fabrication, a desperate attempt to twist words into ownership. My land had never been ceded, never divided, and never placed under their authority. Their argument was smoke and mirrors, and I knew it. Still, the HOA wasn't stupid. They weren't just fighting on paper. They began to wage a subtler war, one designed to wear me down. First, I noticed cars idling near my fence line at night, SUV headlights shining just a little too long, neighbors taking walks near the boundary, as though daring me to confront them. The message was clear: intimidation. Then came the complaints. Suddenly, my ranch was under constant inspection. County code enforcement officers showed up claiming they'd received anonymous reports about my barn being unsafe, my cattle being improperly fenced, even my tractor supposedly leaking oil into the creek. Every complaint was baseless, every inspection a waste of time, but they cost me hours of my day. It was the HOA's playbook in action: bury me in nuisance claims until I snapped. But instead of snapping, I documented. I kept logs of every visit, every officer's name, every piece of paper they left behind. Just as I had done with the playground, I built a file so thick that even a judge would get tired flipping through it. The more they pressed, the more I realized something vital. This wasn't just about a playground. It was about power. The HOA saw me as the last obstacle in their quest to control every inch of land within sight of their development. To them, my ranch was wild, untamed, and, worst of all, the free from their authority. If they could claim even a slice of it, they would prove that no one, not even a landowner with a century-old deed, could stand against them. That realization steeled me. I wouldn't just fight back. I would dismantle them. But before I could act, they escalated again. One morning, as I drove out to check the cattle, I noticed something new at the playground. A fresh sign stood near the edge, planted firmly into the soil. In bold letters, it read, "Community property, private use by HOA members only." The audacity nearly made me choke. They weren't just pretending the playground was theirs. They were declaring it openly, right on my land. That sign was more than arrogance. It was provocation, and it worked. The sight of that sign lit a fire in me that no intimidation, no legal bluff, no petty harassment had managed to spark. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about respect, heritage, and the simple fact that no one, not an HOA, not a smug Karen with a clipboard, not anyone, had the right to rewrite history and steal what generations of my family had built. So I sharpened my counterattack. My lawyer filed the first official lawsuit. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, just a clean, precise claim of trespass, damages, and unpaid rent. But behind the legal language was a sledgehammer. Once filed, it forced the HOA into a corner. They could no longer dismiss me as a cranky rancher or wave off my claims as misunderstandings. Now it was real, official, and headed for court. The effect was immediate. HOA meetings turned tense. Neighbors whispered about rising dues. The board scrambled, holding closed-door sessions and hiring outside counsel. And while they panicked, I made my next move. Remember those nuisance complaints they kept filing? Every false report, every wasted inspection, I compiled them into a countersuit. Harassment, abuse of process, intentional infliction of stress. By the time my lawyer was done drafting, the HOA wasn't just facing rent. They were staring down the barrel of punitive damages. And yet, even as the legal gears turned in my favor, I kept watching. Because I knew people like them didn't quit cleanly. They always had one more trick, one more dirty move to play. Sure enough, it came. Late one night under the cover of darkness, someone cut the fence near the playground. My cattle wandered dangerously close to the development, spooking neighbors and sparking a fresh round of complaints. It was sabotage, plain and simple. A staged crisis meant to paint me as irresponsible, a danger to their perfect community. But just like everything else, I was ready. My property was wired with trail cameras, motion sensors, and enough evidence-gathering tech to rival a small police station. The footage showed exactly who had cut that fence. A pair of HOA board members caught red-handed with bolt cutters in their hands. The next morning, I sent the footage straight to the sheriff. Now, the game had changed again. The HOA had gone from smug land grabbers to saboteurs caught in a criminal act. Their playground wasn't just a trespass. It was the centerpiece of a conspiracy that was unraveling faster than they could patch it together. And as I watched their empire start to crack, I knew one thing with certainty. The real fight was only just beginning. Chapter 3, The Court of Public Opinion. The sheriff's office didn't take long to respond. Within days of handing over the trail camera footage, deputies paid a visit to the neighborhood, and suddenly the smug smiles of the HOA board were nowhere to be seen. For the first time since the playground went up, the board members weren't strutting across my land like they owned it. Instead, they were dodging neighbors' questions, whispering behind closed doors, and desperately trying to spin the story. But you can't spin bolt cutters. The footage was irrefutable. 2 board members, men who had spoken at meetings, shaken hands with residents, and bragged about their community leadership, were caught red-handed sabotaging my fence. And in a small town, word spreads faster than fire in dry grass. The story hit the local newspaper first. HOA members accused of trespassing, property damage, the headline read. By the end of the week, it was the talk of the county. Parents who once cheered the playground, ribbon cutting, were now whispering that the board had gone too far. Neighbors who once thought I was just a cranky rancher suddenly realized I might be the one telling the truth all along. The HOA's carefully crafted image of control was cracking, and I could see the fractures spreading. Of course, the board wasn't going to take it lying down. They released a statement to the press, calling the footage taken out of context. They claimed the board members had been assessing damage to the fence, not causing it, and that the entire thing was being blown out of proportion by a disgruntled landowner. But spin only works when people want to believe you, and by now their neighbors weren't so sure anymore. I noticed the change on weekends. Where crowds of children once filled the playground, now only a handful dared to come. Parents stood awkwardly at the edges, no longer confident this land was safe, no longer convinced the HOA's word was law. The benches sat empty, the swings creaked in the wind without laughter, and the playground, once the HOA's proudest achievement, began to feel like a monument to arrogance. Meanwhile, my legal case moved forward. The lawsuit I filed wasn't just about rent anymore. It had grown teeth. The footage of sabotage gave my lawyer leverage. The nuisance complaints showed harassment, and the trespass itself was undeniable. The HOA wasn't facing a slap on the wrist. They were staring at financial ruin. And the closer the court date loomed, the more desperate their tactics became. Anonymous flyers started showing up in mailboxes around the neighborhood, accusing me of being greedy, of profiting off children's happiness. They claimed I was trying to bankrupt the community for my own gain. It was classic smear: paint the enemy as a heartless villain and hope the crowd turns on him. But smear campaigns only work when the villain stays silent. I didn't. For the first time in years, I invited the local paper out to the ranch. I showed them the survey markers, the century-old deeds, the fences my grandfather had built. I gave them access to the files of nuisance complaints, each one traced back to the HOA's board. And then I gave them the footage. The next article wasn't about me being greedy. It was about a homeowners association gone rogue. Suddenly, the court of public opinion wasn't just leaning in my direction, as it was marching there. Neighbors began showing up at HOA meetings demanding answers. Some asked why their dues were being used to fight a lawsuit the board clearly couldn't win. Others wanted to know why the board members weren't stepping down after being caught on camera. The HOA's once tight grip on the community was slipping, and panic was setting in. But desperation makes people dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the ranch was settling into the quiet of dusk, I heard the distant hum of engines. Not the familiar rumble of farm trucks or tractors, but the sharp, restless roar of SUVs. They parked near the playground, 4 of them, all lined up like a show of force. From my porch, I could see them standing in a cluster, their arms crossed, their voices sharp. HOA board members, their allies, maybe even a few husbands dragged into the fight. They weren't celebrating anymore. They were planning. And though I couldn't hear their words, I knew their intent. They wanted to push back harder. The next morning, I found fresh signs hammered into the ground at the playground's edge. "Community rights matter," one read. Another said, "Stop the greed, save our playground." And the third was the boldest: "We won't pay rent." It was a public declaration of war. But while they played with slogans, I played with evidence. Every sign on my land was another trespass. Every SUV that parked beyond the property line was another incident. And every word they spread only added weight to my claim that the HOA was acting in bad faith. I didn't need to tear their signs down. I didn't need to confront them. All I had to do was let them bury themselves deeper. And they did. The flyers grew nastier, accusing me of being a tyrant land baron, dredging up stories about my family, twisting half-truths into poison. They wanted me isolated, hated, and beaten before we even stepped foot in court. But they miscalculated one thing. For every flyer they spread, another parent remembered the footage of bolt cutters. For every insult they hurled, another neighbor wondered why the board wasn't focusing on fixing the situation instead of making it worse. Slowly, the tide of public opinion shifted further, until whispers turned into open defiance. At one particularly heated HOA meeting, residents demanded a vote of no confidence in the board. The motion barely failed, but the damage was done. The cracks were widening, and even the board knew it. The courtroom battle was coming, and everyone could feel it. As the date drew near, I prepared like a man heading into a storm. My lawyer refined every document, every survey, every photo. Witnesses lined up, neighbors willing to testify about intimidation, county officers willing to admit the complaints were baseless, even the sheriff ready to confirm the fence sabotage. The HOA had bluster and slogans. I had evidence and truth, and in the court of public opinion, that truth had already started winning. But the real test was still ahead, and as much as the board was unraveling, I knew they wouldn't step into that courtroom quietly. They would fight, lie, and claw with every ounce of desperation they had left. And I would be ready. Chapter 4. The Courtroom Showdown. The courthouse was an old stone building that had stood for more than a century, its columns weathered by time, its halls echoing with the weight of countless disputes. Farmers, business owners, families, and neighbors had all passed through those doors to settle matters of land and pride. And now the HOA and I were the latest story to be written within its walls. From the very first step inside, the atmosphere was different. This wasn't just another case on the docket. The benches were full, the air thick with murmurs, and reporters hovered near the doors with notebooks ready. The feud had become too big, too public, too messy for the town to ignore. Everyone wanted to see the showdown. The HOA board arrived together as though strength could be manufactured by numbers. Suits too sharp for a small-town courtroom, briefcases clutched like shields, and expressions hard with defiance. They whispered among themselves, glancing at me as if I were an intruder in their perfect world. But I didn't come alone either. My lawyer walked beside me, calm and steady, carrying the thick file we had built over months of harassment and trespass. Behind us sat neighbors who had grown tired of the board's arrogance, parents who no longer brought their children to the playground, and even county officials who had grown weary of processing the HOA's endless stream of complaints. This wasn't just me versus them anymore. It was the truth against a machine of entitlement. The judge entered, a stern figure who had seen his share of neighborhood squabbles escalate into bitter wars. He didn't smile, didn't scold, didn't joke. He simply called the case to order, and just like that, years of frustration and months of preparation came to a head. The HOA's lawyer went first. With practiced polish, he painted the board as community heroes, selfless volunteers who had beautified the neighborhood by building a playground for the children. He dismissed my lawsuit as greed, portraying me as a man trying to profit from something that brought joy to families. His words were smooth, designed for sympathy, each sentence crafted to tug at heartstrings. For a moment, I could see heads in the audience nodding, caught up in the performance. The board sat taller, their confidence returning as their lawyer spun his tale. But performance is only skin deep. When it was my lawyer's turn, the mask came off. Piece by piece, document by document, he laid out the truth. Survey maps more than a century old. Recorded deeds in my family's name. Photographs showing the playground equipment. Planted firmly across my boundary markers. And then the bombshell, the trail camera footage. The courtroom screens flickered to life. And there it was, the HOA board members, bolt cutters in hand, slicing through my fence under the cover of night. The gasps from the benches echoed like thunder. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their polished image shattering before their neighbors' eyes. The lawyer tried to object, claiming context and misinterpretation. But the footage was undeniable. The more they protested, the guiltier they looked. And then came the harassment file. Stack upon stack of nuisance complaints, each one filed in bad faith, each one dismissed by county officers as baseless. My lawyer called those officers to the stand, and they confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had used local government as a weapon against me. The pattern was unmistakable, and the courtroom could feel it. By the time my lawyer finished, the HOA's story of community service had collapsed into a tale of trespass, sabotage, and abuse of power. But the fight wasn't over. The HOA's lawyer tried to claw back ground, waving his hands dramatically, claiming the playground was beloved by children, and that dismantling it would be a tragedy. He begged the judge to consider the greater good of the community, arguing that a few feet of disputed land shouldn't outweigh the happiness of dozens of families. It was their last card, emotion over evidence. But the judge wasn't swayed by theatrics. His questions were sharp, cutting through the fluff. Did the HOA have permission to build on this land? No. Did they verify ownership before construction? No. Were board members involved in damaging the plaintiff's property? The footage spoke for itself. The answers stacked up like bricks in a wall, boxing the HOA in with no escape. Hours passed, arguments volleyed, and witnesses testified, but the outcome grew clearer with every passing minute. The HOA hadn't just overstepped, they had trampled over the law, convinced their authority was absolute. And now that arrogance was costing them everything. When closing arguments ended, the judge recessed to deliberate. The room buzzed with nervous energy, whispers rising and falling like the hum of cicadas. Some of the HOA's supporters still clung to hope, while others stared at the floor, unwilling to meet their neighbors' eyes. I sat still, calm, knowing that no matter how long it took, the truth was heavy enough to tip the scales. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. His ruling was swift and firm. The playground was built on land that did not belong to the HOA. Every use of it had been unlawful. The rent demand was valid, and the board was ordered to pay back rent at the commercial rate, along with damages for trespass. On top of that, the harassment file earned me additional compensation, and the bolt cutter sabotage resulted in criminal referrals for the board members involved. It was a complete and total victory. The board sat frozen, their faces pale, their carefully rehearsed confidence shattered. The residents behind them murmured in shock, some in anger, others in relief. For the first time, the HOA wasn't untouchable. They were broken, beaten, and publicly humiliated in the very town they thought they controlled. But as I walked out of that courthouse, I knew it wasn't the end. People like them never accept defeat gracefully. They would drag their feet on payments, appeal the ruling, and try every trick in the book to save face. The courtroom had given me the law, but the war for my land wasn't finished yet. And deep down, I could already feel the next move coming. Chapter 5. The HOA's Desperate Gambit. Defeat should have ended things. The gavel had fallen, the judgment was written, and the law was clear. The playground was mine, the rent was owed, and the HOA's sabotage had crossed into criminal territory. By all rights, the story should have ended there. But pride has a way of blinding people. And for the HOA board, pride was all they had left. The days after the ruling were strangely quiet. Too quiet. The playground sat deserted, its bright slides and swings fading under the sun. The signs they had planted, declaring the land community property, were ripped down in the night, no doubt by embarrassed residents who wanted to erase the evidence of their misplaced trust. Neighbors no longer lingered around the HOA clubhouse, and the once smug board members avoided the spotlight like rats after a flood. But silence is never peace. It's only the calm before another storm. The first sign came in the form of a letter, not from the court, but from the HOA itself. Bold, defiant, and dripping with entitlement, it claimed the ruling was under appeal. They refused to pay rent. They refused to dismantle the playground. They even threatened to fine me for creating a hostile environment. It was laughable, but it wasn't harmless. The appeal meant more delays, more legal fees, more months of entanglement. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to bleed me dry. Their gambit was simple. If they couldn't have victory, they would settle for vengeance. Then came the rumors. Whispers spread that I was planning to sell the land to developers, that I was going to tear down the playground and build a strip mall. The HOA didn't just want to challenge me legally. They wanted to poison me in the eyes of the community. If they could make me the villain, maybe they could claw back some measure of control. But rumors are one thing. What they did next was far worse. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and my cattle wandered back toward the barn, I heard the distant hum of machinery. It wasn't farm equipment. It was heavier, industrial. I grabbed my truck keys and drove out toward the property line. What I saw made my stomach turn. A construction crew was on my land. Not a county crew, not workers fixing utilities, but a hired team with bulldozers and dump trucks. And they weren't repairing anything. They were digging. The HOA had hired contractors to expand the playground. Fresh trenches tore into the earth, mounds of dirt piled high where grass once grew. Stakes marked out new boundaries. Ropes stretched across the soil. And workers muttered about clearing space for a community pavilion. It wasn't just defiance. It was escalation. They had lost in court. And yet here they were, doubling down, sinking even more money and pride into something that didn't belong to them. It was the boldest, most reckless move they had made yet. And it was also the one that would destroy them completely. I didn't storm in shouting. I didn't grab a shotgun or try to chase them off. I simply recorded. Every truck, every shovel, every trespasser digging into land that was legally, undeniably mine. And then the next morning, I handed it all over to my lawyer. The second lawsuit was filed within the week, but this one was different. It wasn't about rent or nuisance complaints. It wasn't about harassment. It was about willful, knowing violation of a court order. The HOA wasn't just stubborn now. They were in contempt. The legal system doesn't take kindly to defiance. Word spread quickly, faster than before. This wasn't just a feud anymore. It was a scandal. Parents who once defended the board now wondered where their dues were going. Neighbors whispered about bankruptcy, about special assessments, about how far the HOA would go before dragging them all down with it. The trust that had once held the neighborhood together was dissolving into fear and anger. And the board? They grew more desperate. Flyers reappeared, uglier than before, accusing me of corruption, claiming the judge had been bought. They held emergency meetings, not to address their crimes, but to rally their supporters with half-truths and conspiracy. And when their words failed, they resorted to shadows. One night I found spray paint across my barn door. Community traitor. Another morning my mailbox was smashed in. Small acts, petty vandalism, but enough to remind me that the board wasn't done trying to intimidate me. But intimidation doesn't work on someone with nothing to lose. My ranch had survived droughts, floods, and storms that tore roofs from houses and fences from the ground. A little vandalism wasn't going to scare me off my own land. If anything, it only hardened my resolve. Because the truth was simple. They were running out of moves. The second lawsuit had teeth sharper than the first. The footage of unauthorized construction, paired with the existing judgment, painted a picture of arrogance so blatant even their lawyer struggled to defend it. And with criminal charges still hanging over the board, members caught with bolt cutters, the walls were closing in fast. The board wasn't just losing ground, they were collapsing under the weight of their own defiance. But the thing about desperate people is that they don't think rationally. And as the lawsuits piled up and neighbors grew restless, the HOA board decided to gamble everything on one final reckless move. They would try to seize the land outright. I learned about it through county records. Buried in paperwork, hidden among zoning applications and easement requests, was a proposal filed by the HOA, an attempt to claim eminent domain. They were arguing that the playground, though illegally built, had become a necessary community resource and should therefore be transferred to HOA ownership. It was absurd. A homeowners association doesn't have the power of eminent domain. They aren't the government. They don't get to seize land just because they want it. But the fact that they even tried showed how delusional they had become. And in their desperation, they made a fatal mistake. The application wasn't just a legal farce. It was a confession. In writing, in county records, the HOA admitted that the playground was on my land. After months of denial, after smear campaigns and intimidation, after appeals and construction, they had put the truth in black and white. They had lost. The second lawsuit would crush them financially. The vandalism and sabotage would destroy their reputations. And now their own paperwork had handed me the final proof I needed. The HOA's desperate gambit wasn't just reckless. It was suicidal. And as I stared at that application, I realized something else. Their fall wasn't going to be quiet. It was going to be public, messy, and unforgettable. The community that once trusted them was about to watch their empire collapse in real time. And I was going to make sure of it. Chapter 6. The Collapse of the Board. The cracks in the HOA's empire didn't appear all at once. At first, they were small. A resignation letter here, a hushed argument there. But once the dam began to leak, the flood could not be stopped. The neighborhood, once bound together by fear of fines and rules, had turned on its so-called leaders. It began with the dues. Families who had faithfully paid month after month suddenly refused. Some mailed in checks scrawled with the word protest across the memo line, while others stopped paying altogether. The HOA, already drowning in legal costs, found its treasury shrinking fast. The whispers grew louder. Parents who once defended the playground now demanded answers. Why was their money being spent on lawsuits instead of improvements? Why had the board doubled down on a lost cause? And most importantly, what else were they hiding? The board tried to maintain control. Emergency meetings were called. Flyers went out blaming me, blaming the judge, blaming anyone but themselves. But no amount of finger-pointing could cover the truth. The community had seen the evidence. They had watched me stand in court, watch the judge's ruling, watch the second lawsuit hammer down on the reckless expansion. And then, when the board filed their ridiculous eminent domain stunt, even their most loyal defenders couldn't deny the madness. The collapse wasn't just financial. It was personal. Board members who once strutted across the neighborhood now avoided their own front yards. The president, a woman who had once boasted about protecting property values, found herself shouted down in public meetings. Her vice president stopped showing up altogether. The treasurer admitted during one heated session that the HOA's legal fund was empty, drained dry by their obsession with me and my land. The very people who had once feared fines now laughed at the empty threats. Notices of violation sat unopened in mailboxes, ignored like junk mail. The HOA's bark had lost its bite, and the residents knew it. And then came the resignations. One by one, board members walked away. Some claimed they were stepping down for personal reasons. Others admitted in private that they couldn't face the lawsuits anymore. The vandalism, the spray-painted insults, the smashed mailbox. It had all been traced back to certain board members. When the police came knocking, suddenly loyalty wasn't worth jail time. The neighborhood meetings grew uglier. Shouting matches replaced order. Neighbors demanded refunds for dues, demanded accountability, demanded blood. For years, the board had ruled through intimidation. Now the tables had turned and their victims wanted justice. By the time my second lawsuit reached its first hearing, the HOA board wasn't united anymore. They were fractured, desperate, and pointing fingers at one another. The president blamed the treasurer for mismanaging funds. The treasurer blamed the secretary for bad advice. The secretary blamed the vice president, who had long since vanished. It wasn't a defense. It was a spectacle. And the judge, tired of their antics, didn't hesitate. The contempt charges stuck. The unauthorized construction, the blatant violation of the court order, the reckless attempt to seize land, all of it came crashing down in a ruling so severe that the board members audibly gasped. Heavy fines were levied. Restitution was ordered. The HOA was commanded to dismantle every inch of the playground at their own expense and pay damages for every day it stood on my land. The judgment wasn't just legal, it was financial execution. But the board had already burned through their reserves. With empty accounts and mounting debts, the only way forward was to levy special assessments on the very neighbors who now despised them. And when those notices hit mailboxes, the last shred of loyalty evaporated. People refused. Some threatened their own lawsuits. Others stormed into meetings demanding resignations. And when the board insisted they had no choice, the community made theirs. A petition circulated faster than flyers ever could. Door to door, neighbor to neighbor, signatures gathered not in fear but in fury. By the time the petition landed on the county clerk's desk, it bore more signatures than the HOA had members. The community voted, and in one fell swoop, the entire board was dissolved. It should have ended there. The lawsuits had gutted them. The rulings had humiliated them, and their neighbors had stripped away their authority. The empire they had built on threats and fines had fallen to rubble, but arrogance is a stubborn flame. Even after their dissolution, the former board members clung to scraps of power. They whispered about reorganizing, about fighting back, about how this wasn't the end. They talked of appeals, of calling in favors, of somehow twisting the narrative. But their words rang hollow. They were no longer rulers of a community. They were pariahs, outcasts in their own neighborhood. Meanwhile, the playground that had sparked the war stood like a monument to their failure. The once bright slides grew dull, the swings creaked, and weeds pushed through the mulch. Children no longer played there. Parents no longer gathered. It wasn't a park anymore. It was a reminder of arrogance, of wasted money, of betrayal, and soon even that would be gone. The court-ordered demolition was scheduled. Crews were contracted. The costs billed directly to the remnants of the HOA's accounts. And when the bulldozers arrived, the community didn't protest. They watched. Some even cheered. In a single day, the playground was reduced to rubble. The swings were hauled away, the slides crushed into scrap, the pavilion torn down beam by beam. By sunset, the land was bare again, scarred but free. For the first time in months, my ranch was mine again. But as I stood at the property line, watching the dust settle, I knew the story wasn't truly over. Because desperate people don't vanish quietly. They don't accept defeat gracefully, and the former board members, humiliated, ruined, despised, still had fight left in them. The lawsuits had taken their money. The community had taken their titles. But pride dies last. And as the sun set behind the empty field where the playground once stood, I realized the HOA's final act was still to come. It would not be legal. It would not be orderly. It would be desperate. And it would be dangerous. Chapter 7. The Final Strike. Defeat should have ended them. The board was dissolved. Their power stripped, their money gone, their reputations in ashes. But defeat for people like them wasn't an ending. It was a wound. And wounded pride is the most dangerous thing of all. The first signs came quietly. Strange cars idling near my ranch at night. Gates left ajar that I was sure I had locked. Fences mysteriously cut. Livestock spooked. Tire tracks across fields where no one had permission to be. It was the kind of harassment designed, not to be caught but to unsettle. The last gasp of people who couldn't accept they had lost. Neighbors whispered about it too. Those who had once sat beside the board at meetings now crossed the street to avoid them. But avoidance wasn't enough. The ex-board members didn't just sulk in silence, they simmered. Their defeat had made them pariahs in the community, and every glance, every muttered insult, every angry letter shoved into their mailboxes only stoked the fire. They had lost their thrones, but they weren't ready to live like commoners, and so the plotting began. What they couldn't win in court, they tried to win in the shadows. One night, a firework was launched across my property. Not a harmless sparkler, but a heavy aerial aimed carelessly toward dry brush. It fizzled before it could start a blaze, but the message was clear. Another night, spray paint appeared on my barn wall, crude insults scrawled in red. Tools went missing from my shed. Fence posts were kicked loose, and a section of irrigation pipe was deliberately slashed. Every act reeked of desperation. But desperation can still do damage. By now, the sheriff's department was well aware of the feud. My earlier lawsuits, the contempt charges, the vandalism case, it was all on file. When I reported the harassment, they didn't dismiss me. Patrol cars rolled through more often. Deputies kept watch. But even so, the ex-board members were careful, staying just beyond the reach of cameras, moving under cover of night, striking where proof was thin. Then came the night everything boiled over. It was late, past midnight, when the sound woke me. Not the usual creak of the house or rustle of cattle, but the grinding roar of engines. Headlights flashed across my windows. When I stepped outside, I saw them, trucks, 4 of them, parked across the property line like a blockade. Figures spilled out, flashlights sweeping over the field, over the barns, over everything that was mine. And at the front of them all, the former HOA president herself, shoulders squared, eyes burning with a hatred that had long since left reason behind. They weren't here to talk. They weren't here to reason. They were here to make one final statement, one last act of defiance. The air was thick with adrenaline. I didn't shout. I didn't charge. I did what any rancher outnumbered on his own land would do. I reached for the one thing that always levels the playing field. The shotgun wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The metallic sound of it chambering echoed across the field, louder than any speech. And for the first time that night, I saw hesitation ripple through their little mob. Because bravado thrives in the dark, in numbers, in whispers. But when faced with the cold reality of consequences, of law, of force, of accountability, bravado falters. Still, their leader pushed forward. She shouted, though her words were drowned by the pounding in my ears. She pointed, waved her arms, tried to rally the others. But the spell was broken. Neighbors who had followed her out of loyalty now looked at her with doubt. Some stepped back. Others turned toward their trucks. And then came the flood of red and blue. The deputies had been circling the area for weeks. And luck, or fate, had brought them down the road at the exact moment the standoff unfolded. Sirens wailed, lights blazed, and suddenly the trespassers were caught in the open. Their rebellion exposed for what it was, criminal, not noble. The mob scattered. Some ran for their vehicles. Others froze in place, caught like children sneaking cookies from a jar. And their leader, the once proud HOA president, was tackled before she could even climb back into her truck. It was over. The arrests were swift. The charges serious: trespassing, vandalism, conspiracy. For some, probation would be the best they could hope for. For others, jail time was a real possibility. The HOA, once their shield, no longer existed to protect them. They were on their own, and the law was no longer amused. The community, watching from porches and windows, saw the truth play out in flashing lights. This wasn't leadership. This wasn't protecting property values or defending community standards. This was criminal spite laid bare. By morning, the news had spread. The final blow had landed. Not from me, not from the courts, but from their own arrogance. And in the silence that followed, my ranch stood untouched at last. No more flyers. No more threats. No more playgrounds rising on stolen land. Just fields, fences, cattle, and peace, the way it had always been meant to be. The scars remained, of course. The memories of the lawsuits, the vandalism, the harassment. The neighbors would talk about it for years, telling newcomers the story of the HOA that went too far and the rancher who wouldn't bow. The empty field where the playground once stood became a kind of landmark, a reminder of how arrogance can crumble, how power abused can be stripped away. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't throw a party. I didn't need to. Victory doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just feels like the quiet morning after a storm. The land was mine. The board was gone. And the HOA, once so powerful, now lived only in the whispers of cautionary tales. The final strike had been theirs, reckless, dangerous, doomed. And in making it, they hadn't destroyed me. They had destroyed themselves. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your experiences. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next upload.